Arthur Smith was safe until he wasn't. Where did it go wrong with the former Falcons head coach?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. And guys, we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. We shout out to the everydayers. If you don't know who I am, of course, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka Mr. aka the person who's looking for more AKAs this offseason, aka Locked On Coaching Searches. And all you everydayers out there, really appreciate you guys for tuning in throughout the entire calendar year 2023. I hope you guys continue to tune in 2024. And if you want to become an everydayer of this podcast as we bring you this renewed coaching cycle in January 2024, all you got to do to become an everydayer is to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, I will be joined by Jeff Schultz, formerly of The Athletic, the recently retired writer of all Atlanta sports for The Athletic. And we're going to talk about the Arthur Smith firing and where it went wrong for Arthur Smith. What's next for the Atlanta Falcons? We'll talk a lot about their process in today's episode. So without further ado, let's jump into that conversation with Jeff Schultz, formerly of The Athletic, right now. So we are once again joined by another illustrious guest. He is Jeff Schultz, formerly of The Athletic. We have brought this man out of retirement in order to talk about the Falcons coaching change with the dismissal of Arthur Smith. And Jeff, I recall reading, one of your articles several months back about Arthur Smith being relatively safe unless sort of things, I forgot the exact words you used, but kind of come off the rails down the stretch. So I guess, did that happen over the last 2 months since you wrote that article for The Athletic?
First of all, since you are pulling me out of retirement, Aaron, I've got to say that since I'm just a guy on a fixed income now,
okay,
I think you're going to have to step up my appearance fee a little bit. I don't know what that looks like, but you and I could talk off air, maybe.
Okay. All right. I wish we would have had this conversation before we started.
No, this is a freebie. I'm giving you this. I'm just
all right. Thank you.
But yes, I was certainly led to believe, and I believe it to be true that it wasn't far more likely than not that Arthur Smith was going to be back. I don't know exactly what week that was that I wrote that. I probably wrote it a couple of times. I know the last time I wrote it was after they beat the Colts. And I believe I'm pretty sure that's the way things were leaning at that time. Going into those last 2 weeks, I certainly did not foresee the Bears game. I didn't necessarily think they were definitely going to win, but I didn't see that result. And let me just be upfront about this. I didn't see the Chicago game. I was actually in Pittsburgh at a wedding. And strangely enough, that game wasn't on TV in Pittsburgh. But yeah, with the Bears game and the Saints game, the way things unraveled, even if you were to take the position that, they don't turn the ball over and there's better quarterback play, they got a shot. There's certainly those games are close. But even with that position, the fact that there had been sort of some question whether Arthur Smith was in trouble, that certainly tilted in that direction. Now, personally, I'm of the belief, and I realize I'm sort of going against the grain here from the fan base. I didn't have a question when Jim Moore got fired. I didn't have a question when Mike Smith got fired. Certainly Dan Quinn, Petrino was in a whole different category. I thought those were all the right decisions. I have a question about this, and I understand the way the Falcons finished. I understand, it was Arthur Smith's and Terry Fontenot's responsibility to pick a quarterback that should have gotten them through the season better. That was their plan. There's no question that was not their long-term solution at quarterback. I think on some level they would acknowledge this now, but they thought he would be better, and they should bear some responsibility for that. But I would almost say I think this is a panic move. I would not have fired Arthur Smith personally. I thought he deserved a shot, given the work of his first 2 years with Terry Fontenot, to pick a quarterback potentially to see what he could do. I don't think his offensive resume before coming to Atlanta was a mistake. I understand there's two sides of that story and two opinions on that. But here's where we are. It's a tough business, as he has said many times. Any coach would tell you many times. I'm not feeling real comfortable about this search. I just got to be honest with you. And the weird thing is, Aaron, is the Falcons this is a really good job right now, I think. I mean, other than a quarterback, which is granted the most important position on the field, this team's in pretty good shape cap-wise. They've got some pieces to build around on both sides of the ball. They've got draft picks. If they want to make a trade up in the draft, they could do it. If they want to trade a pick or two to get an established player, they could do it. It's an ownership that'll spend money. They'll do whatever it has to do to win. It's a somewhat loyal fan base, I guess. If you're winning, I don't really know how to describe the fan base, but it's a much better job now than it was 3 years ago. But I just don't really feel comfortable, honestly, with the way things are right now. And sorry, so I'll go off on one more tangent. The fact that the search is basically be done by Arthur Blank and Rich McKay, I'm just not really totally comfortable with. I think there's more of a big picture issue here, but that's just my opinion. Now I'll let you ask me a question.
Well, I kind of want to, that gets to sort of what my next question is going to be about, sort of what's next
right
for this regime. And guys, we will get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, discussing the Falcons process that involves Rich McKay. Should it not? We'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. And while the weather is getting colder, the NFL offers over at FanDuel stay hot in this new year. You got to check out America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed, win or lose. And if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, now is the time to get in on the action. The app is easy to use. There's so many different types of bets, spreads, player props, over-unders. You want to build a parlay. You want to look for the most popular parlay so you can bet a little and win a lot. Check out the new Parlay Hub. That's what FanDuel has offered for you over at FanDuel.com/lockedon. And you can, get that layup this year with some of these bets. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. I know when we talked about this several years ago, before Arthur Smith was hired, you expressed reservations about Rich McKay's involvement in the organization and whether that would make Atlanta an attractive place.
Right.
And so I'm assuming you still have similar reservations today?
Well, I thought it was pretty telling, despite what Arthur Blank and Rich McKay said in the press conference today on Monday, that Terry Fontenot was not there at the press conference. I think they justified it as he's back in the building at Flowery Branch, dealing with the coaches and all the employees there. And that all sounds well and good. But, what does it say that the general manager of the team, even if he's not necessarily a guy the coach answers to, but the guy who's clearly the only guy in charge of personnel right now and will have a quote unquote say or input, I think was the word they used in the strange press conference. The fact that he's not even there at the press conference today to answer questions, I thought was very strange. And yes, as an outside person looking in, I think hypothetically, as you look at candidates, you'd still be able to get any sort of high profile coordinator. Those guys want head coaching jobs, and those guys will look at the talent and say, I can win there. if you want somebody with any autonomy, or someone who's going to demand autonomy or a presence, then I think you're going to have more of a problem. I mean, last time they hired a first-time GM and a first-time coach. I don't know that this would be any different. I assume Terry Fontenot's back. They're saying he's back. But that could really depend on, honestly, who they hire. If Rich McKay is staying in the organization, would he hire someone who wants more power than him or wants equal power than him? Or would he want someone who he could sort of oversee and judge from a splatter-proof distance in the safe executive suite? That's kind of been the case, honestly, in this organization for a while. And ultimately, as much as I'm a big admirer of Arthur Blank for being both, and I've written this many times, both financially and emotionally invested in his team, he really wants to win. I just don't know. I mean, at some point, there's a problem with the process, okay? They're going to be hiring their 7th head coach. Do I have this right? 6th head coach.
Yeah.
6th head coach in Blank's 20 plus years, 22, whatever it is. And since Rich has been there. And at some point, they're saying, well, some of these coaches were successes, right? One went to the Super Bowl, 2 or 3 went to the NFC title games. I understand that, but is it a successful process when you're hiring your 6th head coach in 20 to 22 years? Is that how you define a successful process in the NFL these days or in sports? I'm not saying everybody needs to be like the Steelers, but I wouldn't call this a successful process. That's not stability. Nothing what's happened in the last 20 years screams stability to me. I don't think anybody in the fan base would say it's a stable organization. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question there, but I just, if it were me and I were the owner, I would be looking to hire somebody at the very, 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 very top. Now, I don't know who that looks like, what that looks like, but I would hire some executive at the very top and say, what do we need? What direction do we go? But I think this could just be some of the same of what we've been seeing over the last several years.
Okay. Now, my next question is about, and maybe this piggybacks on that point that you're making about someone who would be at the top. Mm-hmm. And I'm just thinking about coaches that might want to have a significant say in sort of those things.
I know those 2 names you're going to mention, but go ahead.
And so like you sit there and you go, the tendency in the NFL historically is you go in the opposite direction of the coach that you just fired, right? And you had a young offensive-minded coach in Arthur Smith that was a first-time head coach. Right. So the opposite of that would be an older defensive-minded head coach with previous head coaching experience. And so you hear all this Bill Belichick buzz, and it seems to make sense, at least base operating off of that level. And I'm curious, are you talking, when you're talking about an executive, are you just talking about someone who's just going to take over for Rich McKay as team president? Or are you talking about one person who has the complete vision for the organization and someone like a Bill Belichick presumably would be that type of person? So I'm just digging deeper on that sort of.
Yeah, sure. I get it. Now, the Belichick question isn't so much we had an offensive guy before, now we go defense. I mean, I think most would agree the Falcons were pretty good defensively this year. I think it's more about hiring a guy with a proven track record, right? And Arthur Blank Robert Kraft is one of his closest friends, maybe his closest friend among NFL owners, as much as those guys could be close friends. And he has an enormous respect for the Patriots organization. He's always been fascinated by an organization that could win that many years in a row. Personally, I'm more fascinated by the Steelers, a team that has won many years, most years, with different quarterbacks and very few coaches because they always seem to get it right. My view of Bill Belichick is, yes, first of all, if he is done with the Patriots, and as we're taping this, he's not done with the Patriots, but if he is done with the Patriots, he will want a job where he has significant say, maybe a title, president and coach, whatever that looks like. I don't know that and this is going to sound very strange for a guy who is in the argument as one of the greatest coaches of all time. I honestly wouldn't be very excited about that hire. He's 71 years old. He's one of the few coaches in the NFL that lost fewer games in the last 2 years than Arthur Smith. He won 12 games in the last 2 years. They won, 4 games this year? I don't know. He has not won a playoff game in the last 5 years. He hasn't won a playoff game since the last time they won a Super Bowl. He hasn't proven he can win without Tom Brady. This is going to sound really harsh, but it's fact. That was a really well-run organization. A lot of people in that organization I really respected, one of whom was Scott Pioli. They did things right. That's one side of it. The other side of it is when you get a great quarterback, he can make a lot of people look really good. And I'm not saying Bill Belichick isn't a Hall of Fame coach and is not going to go down as one of the greatest coaches of all time. I'm just saying he's 71 years old, and what's he done lately? And frankly, he's a far better coach than he is as a GM. I mean, the talk in New England is if he does stay, although that seems like a long shot right now, he would basically give up some personnel say, because that organization is in really poor shape personnel-wise. And they have been for a while, honestly. I think they even were in Brady's last couple of years there. I think he covered up for a lot of their shortcomings. And so that hire would not excite me. I certainly understand why he would be excited about potentially coming to the Falcons, because he looks at the personnel and probably thinks I can do that. We just need to get a quarterback. I understand why Blank would be excited in Belichick, because he would win the press conference and people would get excited, and maybe he could sell some PSLs or stop people from jumping ship on their PSLs. So from a business perspective, I get that. I have a hard time getting my head around, number one, is he the right guy? But frankly, also number two, Arthur Blank is such a consensus guy. I mean, every hire he has made it's not about giving a guy all the power. Okay. There was a point at which they danced with Nick Saban for a very short time before he went to the Dolphins. And they said no to Nick Saban or went away because Nick wanted the power, obviously. And certainly Nick didn't prove to be a great NFL head coach because he couldn't handle the losing. But my point is that he is not a guy. Arthur Blank has never been a guy who wants to give all the power to somebody. And the next name you might bring up, Jim Harbaugh. I mean, it's really rare in NFL coaching searches to have proven head coaches available, right? Most of them are in a TV booth and decided not to coach anymore. But the fact that, like Jim Harbaugh, if he didn't have something perceived as baggage, every single team in the NFL, every owner in the NFL with an opening would be after Jim Harbaugh right now. The fact that the last time he danced on returning with the thought of returning to the NFL, he didn't have offers. Minnesota, I think it was Minnesota, right? He went there thinking he had the job, then he didn't have the job, and then he went back to Michigan, from what I recall. There's a handful of teams that I think would be looking at Harbaugh now. And my guess is he probably ends up returning now and taking a job. But the fact that he wears people down, or has a reputation of wearing people down, and he's a coach who walks through the door and you're probably going to win 10 games, that really says something about him. And there's no question any job he takes, he's going to want some power and personnel and title and whatever it's going to look like. So I just don't know if either one of those guys are a great fit. That's just my personal belief. And that means you're back to, let's go for the hot coordinator, right? Which is generally what they've always done.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And there's still more to come from today's episode with Jeff Schultz, our guest. And we'll wrap up today's episode talking about sort of the crapshoot nature of hiring NFL coaches. And are we just basically hoping that the Falcons, get this one right and, that sort of Hail Mary sort of hire. And we'll get into that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about PrizePicks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And now that basketball season is here, they have unveiled their Specials League, which is a league specifically created for combination projections that includes 2 or more players from different leagues and different sports, right? You can combine NBA, college basketball, college football, NFL, NHL. It's all available at PrizePicks. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250. It's simple to play. All you got to do is pick 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats. And the more entries you make, the more money you can make, up to 25 times your money. That's what makes PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app, because there's quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of player and stat types. And of course, it's just you versus the projections. You're not going up against, thousands of other people that are picking the same things. It's just more or less than what PrizePicks is projected. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL. That's in lowercase. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. I know a lot of people, when there is this type of dismissal, they get excited, right? And you've already expressed your reservations about that. Do you feel like there's somebody out there that could be like, okay, this was worth it? This is the type of person? Or is it, sort of asking a question that was asked to Arthur Blank during the press conference, which is like, is hiring coaches a crapshoot? And that's one of the things I've talked about on this podcast, where it's just like, you just don't really know with a lot of these coordinators. And, I was doing some research because a listener asked me a question about sort of the Falcons process, and I was doing some research with other teams, and they were asking me about how the GM is not involved with the hiring, and I was doing the research, and I was like, well, none of the playoff teams really had a head coach hired by their current GM. And so I was like, in the process of doing it, I was like looking at the Dolphins and like Chris Greer, their GM, and Mike McDaniel. And I was reading articles written, 2 years ago when they hired Mike McDaniel, and everybody was just talking about how terrible the process was for the Miami Dolphins during that. And they were like, oh, they should have hired Josh McDaniels instead of Mike McDaniel or whatever. You know how that whole thing goes. And so I was just sitting there just thinking about, like, everybody's always critical of the process, but then at the end of the day, if you just hire a good coach, all those conversations go out the door. And so I guess my question to you is, like, is that what we're just waiting for? We're just hoping that it all comes together and the Falcons find the right coach that can not only just go to the NFC Championship game, but go beyond and win a Super Bowl?
Yeah, first of all, in the process, Aaron, I'd say it's a really interesting topic. It is true that in most cases these days, it's not old school. It's not like it used to be. The owner doesn't hire the owner may hire the GM, but the GM doesn't necessarily hire the coach. The way most searches are now are guys are almost hired at the same time. From what I recall, when the Seattle Seahawks hired
Pete Carroll.
Thank you, Pete Carroll. They hired him and had 3 GM candidates and had him talk to the 3 potential GM candidates to see where they mixed. I didn't really get how the Falcons, Rich, Arthur, whoever it was, explained it in the press conference, but Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith were both basically hired at the same time, right around the same time. Arthur Smith was the guy. I mean, he's the hot. How do I put this without? I don't mean to diminish Terry Fontenot at all, okay? But generally speaking, there are hot coaching candidates. Which Arthur Smith, if people want to have their own revisionist history, that's fine. But Arthur Smith was a very hot coaching candidate 3 years ago. That's where the real competition is. You're also interviewing potential GMs, and you're interviewing potential GMs with the idea of, we want this kind of guy who will mix with this kind of guy. And at some point you have the two meet, which is what they happen. So it is true that GMs don't necessarily hire coaches anymore. in terms of the crapshoot question, I thought it was a really good question, and I was stunned by Arthur Blank's answer. Well, I shouldn't say I was stunned by Arthur Blank's answer, because if he says, yes, it is a crapshoot, it's sort of it doesn't really look good. So I get that. But of course it's a crapshoot. How is it that, how can you say it's not a crapshoot? Drafting players is a crapshoot. I mean, trades are crapshoots. I mean, how do you look at the guys the Falcons have hired since 2020, or excuse me, over the last 20 years, and say hiring coaches is not a crapshoot? Of course it's a crapshoot. This is sports. It's all a crapshoot. And you don't really know. I mean, maybe the Steelers really knew when they hired a one-year defensive coordinator to Mike Tomlin, he was going to end up being really good. Although you want to ask, Steeler fans may not tell you that today. The Baltimore Ravens hired a special teams coach, John Harbaugh. I mean, and then you've got the hottest of offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators out there who are hired that everybody's sure is the guy. And then the whole thing explodes. I mean, no Falcons fan thought Mike Smith was going to be anything. Who's Mike Smith? He actually turned out to be one of the better coaches they ever had. And so of course it's a crapshoot. And, you know, if it were me, you haven't asked me that question yet. If we take Belichick and Harbaugh off the table, I mean, I would seriously look at Brian Flores. I like the possibility of him. But if you really like, I will say this, if you really like what the defense is doing, I almost think you have to hire an offensive guy again. I think you hire the best candidate, obviously, but Arthur Smith failed, and we could go into 100 reasons why. The biggest being he didn't have a good quarterback, and he picked the wrong guy. They picked the wrong guy. But it's all about trying to best utilize their offensive weapons, right? So how do you not go down that road of an offensive guy, an offensive coordinator? And yeah. I mean, that's my view. And we could throw out names of OCs. I tell you one name nobody's really talking about right now. And I'm not saying this should be the top candidate, but if you look at candidate lists, he's not listed anywhere right now. Joe Brady. You know, I mean, when it was clear that they were hiring Fontenot, it was unclear about pairings and matchings, or I should say when Fontenot was viewed as one of the guys. And the Falcons were all about trying to out-saint the Saints. Brady was a hot guy. What happened in Carolina wasn't his fault when he was there as the OC. He goes to Buffalo. He's just a quarterback coach. Then he takes over as OC when was it Ken Dorsey got fired?
Yeah,
mid-season, and he led the Bills to a nice finish. I mean, I would look at him, but again, him, Ben Johnson, Eric Bieniemy. Obviously, we don't really know. It's a crapshoot, Aaron. I don't care what other place says. It's a crapshoot.
Well, yeah, I agree with you on that. I think if I was going to defend Arthur Blank's statement, and this is not what he said, but I think the only aspect that makes it not a crapshoot is the ability of that guy to win you over in the room. And that's ultimately what it kind of boils down to. Who's going to be a good head coach? You just sit in the room for 4 hours with these guys, or however long these interviews take nowadays. And you just hope by the end of that 4 hour period, you feel like, yeah, I'll run through a wall for that guy. And that's ultimately what the choice kind of boils down to. And then whether or not that vision that you have after that 4 hour, endurance fest, right? You might be a little wonky by the end of that 4 hour interview. You just hope it kind of comes to fruition, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And that's really it in a nutshell.
You're making my point, honestly. I mean, the first guy that the Falcons hired after in the Arthur Blank regime, after firing Dan Reeves, who was the last coach hired by this organization that had a successful NFL head coaching resume, was Dan Reeves. It was that long ago. The first coach hired was Jim Mora. Jim Mora, who later proved to be a poor head coach, and was really just honestly not even that great as a coordinator. But he walked in, the story goes, interview with the Falcons, and Arthur Blank was so enamored of. He had a polished interview. He had great answers. He had this thick binder of his career and all these things. And the presentation was so top notch that they were sold, or let's just say the owner was sold. This is my guy. What you don't know, and you could go back and look at Jim Mora's 3 years. You don't know is how he's going to handle locker room situations, how he's going to handle players, whether he's going to play favorites with certain guys or not. You go look at Jim Mora's first 18 games and next 18 games. I mean, it was like right in the middle, almost exactly in the middle of season 2 where things tanked. I understand you had a Michael Vick situation going on, and all these other things, and this is before Jim Mora went on the radio and said he wanted to coach at the University of Washington, and that was his dream job, which is fine when you don't have a job. He didn't know. You can't tell that in an interview. Okay. That's where the crapshootness, if we can use that word, comes in. Dan Quinn, great guy, really good defensive coordinator, really was loved by players, and hired good people for his staff, notably Kyle Shanahan. They went to the Super Bowl. What you didn't know about Dan Quinn was, at some point when you have to really set boundaries and be tough on players, could Dan Quinn do that? Dan Quinn didn't lose the locker room in terms of, I won't play for this guy. Dan Quinn lost the locker room in terms of those guys just didn't really respect him, or to the point of listening to him. You almost need a little fear sometimes with certain guys, and Dan lost that. I think next time Dan Quinn's a head coach, I think he'll be a better head coach from it because of it. I think next time Arthur Smith's a head coach, because I think he will be again, I think he'll be a better head coach. Sometimes you learn things the second time around. But you just don't know that the first time. Even when you hire an established head coach, you don't know it. You don't know that if Bill Belichick comes here, he's going to end up being Super Bill. Crapshoot, Aaron, crapshoot.
No, I agree. Well, Jeff, we can talk about this all day, but we're not. And, now that you're retired, I know you're probably not spending as much time on Twitter or where else, but, and certainly you're not writing anymore, but if, you got anything that you want to plug, go ahead and plug it.
I'm just going to let things sit here right now. I'm on a couple boards related to recovery. I still have my Twitter site, Jeff Schultz, ATL. I am deciding, and it's going to be a couple of months, I think, before I really kind of decide what I'm going to do next. And I'm going to try to catch up on sleep, non-sports reading, and wait for my friend Aaron Freeman to get back to me on any potential offers for podcast appearances. I'm sure whatever decision you make will be the right decision.
Not a crapshoot.
Oh, it won't be a crapshoot. We're having things written down. I do like your background, by the way. It's a very nice Zoom background, or whatever platform we're on here. Sorry. Yeah, look, I always enjoy being on your podcast. I'll be on anytime. We could figure out some, reasonable appearance fee, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, Jeff, I've always appreciated you coming on. I remember the first time you came on to talk about how Roddy White has plenty left in the tank way back in 2015, and Kyle Shanahan, was not doing right by him back then. So
that's right.
I remember that well, and you've come on very frequently in the year since. Unfortunately, probably too often to talk about the Falcons losing or the Falcons getting rid of a head coach, but I feel like you're the best person to talk to in those circumstances. So that is a credit to you, my friend. And I hope this is not the last time that we have you on the podcast. Now that you're retired, I hope we'll be able to lure you back out. But, I might have to, send a memo up the ladder here at Locked On to see what we can get you on some of those appearance fees in order to sort of lure you back.
Well, you have my cell phone, and if you just send me 3 straight text messages and I don't respond, then you've got your answer.
Okay, Jeff. I really appreciate you. My first guest of 2024. Hopefully we will see what's what with this Falcons coaching search and what the rest of this year makes. But if we don't speak for a while, I wish you the best in your retirement, and take it easy. Don't you've gotten out now. You don't have to worry about Atlanta sports bringing it down for you anymore. So you're free.
I appreciate that. Thanks for your blessings and your and your wishes. Thanks. And you need to try to decompress a little bit. Okay. I mean, just, it's going to be okay. Just, there's a plan, and we're powerless over some stuff, right? Okay, I won't get too spiritual on you here, but
Jeff, that's what the gummies are for. So I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be
okay. Good.
All right. So, guys, that's going to do it for us. Appreciate Jeff Schultz. Tomorrow's episode, normally we would do an all 22 review of the Saints game, but we're going to punt that to the end of the week. We'll either do that Friday or Saturday, depending on sort of what other developments happen over the course of the week. Tomorrow's episode instead is the tentative plan right now is we'll probably talk about some of the top candidates, looking at potentially the top 3 names on the market: Ben Johnson, the Lions offensive coordinator, Bill Belichick, and Jim Harbaugh. Although I'm skeptical of whether any of those guys are going to wind up being the Falcons head coach, just because, going back to something I said with Jeff, like typically it's the guy that win you over in the room. And we'll see if those guys win the Falcons over, but those are kind of the 3 big names to get the ball rolling. We'll talk more about other potential options as the week unfolds. We'll talk about the quarterback position and what options the Falcons have there, especially after the national championship game, where 2 of those potential options, and Michael Penix and JJ McCarthy, will know a little bit more about what those guys look like in their projections to the NFL. But that's the plan right now. And of course, we want you to keep tuning in each and every day and become an everydayer as we continue this coaching search over the next several weeks. And then we probably take an even deeper dive into the quarterback conversation thereafter, starting in probably February and March and leading up to potentially April if the Falcons don't resolve that issue in March. So that is the plan for the offseason. And that's going to do it for us, guys. Check out Locked On Sports today. They're a 24/7 streaming channel if you want to get the lowdown on all the biggest sports stories across all the leagues. And of course, if you want more local flair, that's Locked On Sports Atlanta, their 24/7 streaming channel. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.